All right. So last class, we talked about how to use the constructor to initialize our objects. Let's look at that kind of thing again. So we have our rectangle constructor. It takes two formal parameters, rect width and rect height. So when I call my constructor down here, I'm going to provide two actual parameters. I'm going to fill those in. We're going to initialize our class's instance variables. Just a little review of last class. What do we think will happen if I try to do this? What happens if I provide a different number of actual parameters from my number of formal parameters?
It's going to cause an error. It won't create the object.
Can you say that one more time, a little bit louder?
It's going to cause an error.
Absolutely correct. It will cause an error saying, hey, you can't do that. I don't know what you're trying to do. You've given me one number. I'm expecting two numbers. What's going on here? Now, what if I wanted to use only one number? What if I wanted to make a square with that as my side length? Well, what I can do is I can add an extra constructor. So I'm going to create another constructor underneath my first one, also named rectangle, so they have the exact same name. But here we can see that they have different numbers of formal parameters. This one is accepting two formal parameters. This one is accepting one formal parameter. We're using that one to initialize both width and height. When we have multiple constructors with the same name, but different formal parameters, that's called overloading. And that sounds like it might be a bad thing. Overloading is a good thing in Java. It lets us create these constructors that can operate in different ways. So if I have both of these constructors, I can make a rectangle and define both its width and height individually, or I can make a rectangle that's just going to be a square where I give one number and that's going to be assigned to both width and height. We can even have a constructor that doesn't accept any formal parameters, and then we can just assign the values to our instance variables manually. We can assign literal values as the programmer and just say, if I don't get any numbers, my width and height are just going to be 10. So let's get a little bit of a look at what that would look like in our code. I can have all three of these constructors in my rectangle class. So I can have my public rectangle with my two formal parameters. When I actually use it, I'm going to say rectangle rect1. Rect1 equals new rectangle 1242. So I'm providing two pieces of information. So my rect1 will have a width of 12 and a height of 42. If I make my constructor with only one formal parameter, I can call it with one actual parameter. And given what we see here, I would give that 30 to both width and height. So you can see how it looks over on this end. And last, my third constructor, if I make a rectangle with no formal parameters, as the programmer, I'm just going to manually determine what values those should be. So if I make my rectangle 3 using that constructor, rectangle 3 will have a width of 10 and a height of 10. Does this process of overloading make sense? How it works, why it works, how to use it? Right. A brief little refresher of how objects are stored in memory. when I write my rectangle, my rect equals new rectangle 1515. When I initialize my rectangle variable, that variable, my rect, is going to store the location in my computer's memory. It's going to store a reference to where my object data is actually stored. So my variable, my rect, I have my box, and it's actually looking over here at this bigger box with smaller boxes inside of it. And the smaller boxes are the width and height. And if I'm using a different class, it would be any other instance variables contained within that class. Now, if I declare an object, but do not initialize it, then my variable, my rect, will not be referencing any object data because I haven't given it any object data to look at. When an object reference is not pointing toward any object data, it is considered to be null. So the value in my rect box is null, saying I'm not looking at any value right now. So null object references don't allocate any memory. This is just important for us to know. If an object is uninitialized, it will equal null. And null it just means there's no value here. There's nothing to look at. All right, so we have used other programmers classes before, namely the scanner class. So we are allowed to use classes that have been defined by other programmers in our programs. When we use a class that someone else has defined and created, we are what's called a client of that class. So when we use the scanner class, we are a client of the scanner class. So let's look here at the documentation for the constructor that we've been using for the scanner class. And I'll show you guys what it looks like to actually find documentation. But here is the constructor we've been using for the scanner class. What we've been doing is we've been declaring our scanner type variables, and we've been saying scanner input equals new scanner system.in. We have been instantiating the scanner class every time we do this because we are calling the constructor for that scanner class, and we're making a scanner typed object. So if we look between our line of code and our documentation here, we have our constructor name. It's the same, scanner and scanner. We have our system.in, which is our actual parameter. And if we look down at the documentation, we have our formal parameter, which is named source, and it's of the type input stream. So what does that tell us about the type of system.in? What type is that value?
It's an input stream.
It's an input stream because we can see this parameter would fit into this slot because there's only really the one slot, and that variable is of the input stream type. So our system.in must be of the input stream type. So if I want to look at other constructors for this class, I can Google, let's say Java scanner class, and I've Googled this before, so I can click on here. And so any class that is created by the people who made Java, which includes scanner, and there's a good number of them, will be well documented. There will be lots of documentation about how to use the class, what goes into the class. So there's all kinds of information about using the scanner class in this web page. So let's look at the constructors. Here we can see all of the different constructors that are available in this scanner class. So all of these have been overloaded, so we can use any one of them. So if I click on the name of one, I'll jump down to that spot on my page. So here we can see the constructor that I took a screenshot of. We have our public scanner with our input stream source. And it'll say what that constructor does and what the parameters are. And we can look at all of the different constructors. So if we wanted to do some other version of input, we can look at this documentation and understand how we might initialize our scanner object. Does finding and looking through documentation make sense? And it'll be more relevant as we move further into using other people's classes. So let's take a quick look at an example. Here we have the rectangle class with an overloaded constructor. We've got the initial constructor with our 2 parameters, and we have our second constructor with the single parameter. So when I look at my rectangle tester, I'm going to create 2 different rectangle objects, one called room, where I use both of where I use 2 actual parameters. I'm going to make a second rectangle called die, like a die that you roll, and it will have a single actual parameter. So I'm going to use my 2 different constructors, and when I run this, I'm going to see the output. So my rectangle room is a rectangle with a width of 10 and a height of 3, and my rectangle die is a rectangle with width and height of 1, because of the way that my constructors are written. And I could add even more constructors to this code if I wanted to take any number of different things for my width and heights. So any questions on how overloading works, how any of this goes? Does that make sense? All right, then I will stop my share.